In the cold dawn of a Florentine winter in 1513, Niccolò Machiavelli sat in his modest country estate, stripped of power, exiled from the very city he had served with unwavering dedication. The man who had once advised princes and shaped the destiny of republics now found himself utterly alone, his political career destroyed, his allies scattered like leaves in an autumn wind. Yet in this moment of absolute abandonment, Machiavelli discovered a truth that would echo through the centuries: the most dangerous enemy is not the one who stands before you with sword drawn, but the weak version of yourself that crumbles under pressure. This realization became the cornerstone of what we now understand as the art of thriving in isolation, the Machiavellian wisdom that teaches us how to transform abandonment into advantage, how to forge strength from solitude, and how to build an empire of self that no external force can topple. The weak self is insidious. It whispers of inadequacy when challenges arise, seeks validation from those who would use our neediness against us, and crumbles at the first sign of adversity. It is the part of us that believes we cannot succeed without the approval, support, or presence of others. This weak self is not merely an inconvenience, it is a fundamental threat to our survival and success in a world that is often indifferent to our struggles and sometimes actively hostile to our ambitions. Consider the nature of dependency. When we rely on others for our sense of worth, for our direction in life, or for our emotional stability, we hand them the keys to our destruction. They need not lift a finger to harm us, they need only withdraw their support, and we collapse like a structure built on shifting sand. This is not strength disguised as vulnerability, this is vulnerability masquerading as connection. The Machiavellian approach recognizes this fundamental flaw in human nature and offers a radical solution: the systematic dismantling of the weak self through deliberate cultivation of independent power. This is not about becoming callous or disconnected from humanity, rather, it is about developing such profound inner strength that external circumstances cannot dictate our internal state or determine our ultimate success. The process begins with a brutal inventory of our dependencies. What aspects of our self-worth rely on others' opinions? What goals have we abandoned because we lacked support? What dreams have we deferred because we feared proceeding alone? Each dependency identified is a vulnerability that must be addressed, not through finding better sources of external validation, but through building internal systems that make such validation unnecessary. Marcus Antonius, the Roman general, understood this principle intimately. When he found himself isolated in Egypt, cut off from Roman support and facing the combined might of Octavian's forces, he did not collapse into despair or frantically seek new alliances. Instead, he drew upon reserves of inner strength he had cultivated through years of self-discipline and strategic thinking. Though his final campaign ended in defeat, the manner of his resistance demonstrated a crucial truth: a man who has mastered himself cannot be broken by external circumstances, only by the limitations of mortal flesh. The weak self operates from a position of scarcity, scarcity of confidence, scarcity of resources, scarcity of options. It sees the world as a zero-sum game where success depends on taking from others or being given by others. The strong self, forged through Machiavellian principles, operates from abundance, an abundance that springs not from external wealth or connections, but from an unshakable foundation of self-reliance and strategic competence. This transformation requires what Machiavelli termed the virtue of necessity, the ability to extract strength from constraint, opportunity from limitation, and power from powerlessness. When Frederick the Great found himself surrounded by enemies with no hope of external aid, he did not seek to convince others of his righteousness or appeal to their mercy. Instead, he restructured his thinking, his military, and his approach to governance based on the assumption that he would receive no help from anyone. This assumption freed him to make decisions based purely on strategic merit rather than on what might please potential allies. The cultivation of inner strength begins with the recognition that emotional independence is not cold detachment, but rather the development of internal sources of validation, motivation, and satisfaction that cannot be manipulated or withdrawn by others. When your sense of purpose comes from within, when your standards are self-imposed and self-maintained, when your satisfaction derives from personal excellence rather than external recognition, you become anti-fragile, not merely resistant to external pressures, but actually strengthened by them. This process involves three fundamental shifts in perspective. First, the shift from external to internal locus of control. Instead of asking, "How can I get others to help me?" the question becomes, "How can I achieve this goal regardless of whether anyone helps me?"
Second, the shift from emotional dependency to emotional sovereignty.
Rather than seeking others to manage our emotional state, we develop the capacity to maintain equilibrium regardless of external circumstances. Third, the shift from validation seeking to value creation. Instead of trying to prove our worth to others, we focus on creating genuine value that speaks for itself. The weak self fears isolation because it has never learned to be alone without being lonely, to be independent without being isolated, to be self-sufficient without being selfish. The Machiavellian approach teaches us that solitude is not punishment but opportunity, the space in which we can develop the skills, perspectives, and inner resources that will serve us regardless of external circumstances. Consider the story of Admiral Lee Sun-sin, who found himself not only without support from his own government but actively undermined by court politics that stripped him of his rank and resources. When the Japanese invasion resumed and his incompetent replacement had destroyed the Korean fleet, he was recalled to face an impossible situation with minimal resources and no allies. Yet he had spent his time in exile not in bitterness or despair, but in deepening his understanding of naval warfare, developing new strategies, and maintaining his physical and mental condition. When thrust back into command, he achieved what many consider the most stunning naval victory in history, destroying over 300 enemy ships while losing none of his own. The destruction of the weak self is not an event but a process, a continuous practice of choosing strength over comfort, independence over dependency, strategic thinking over emotional reaction. It requires what Machiavelli called the long view, the ability to sacrifice immediate comfort for long-term power, immediate approval for long-term respect, immediate security for long-term freedom. This practice manifests in daily decisions that seem small but accumulate into profound transformation.
When faced with a problem, do we immediately seek someone to solve it for us, or do we first exhaust our own resources and creativity? When criticized, do we rush to defend ourselves or calmly evaluate whether the criticism contains useful information? When isolated, do we panic and grasp for any available connection, or do we use the solitude to strengthen ourselves? The weak self operates from fear of rejection, fear of failure, fear of being alone. These fears make us predictable, manipulable, and ultimately weak. The strong self, forged through deliberate practice and strategic thinking, operates from curiosity about what is possible when we stop limiting ourselves through dependence on others' approval or support. This transformation is particularly crucial in our modern context, where social media and constant connectivity have created unprecedented opportunities for external validation and, consequently, unprecedented vulnerabilities to external manipulation. The person who needs likes, shares, and comments to feel valuable is as vulnerable as a medieval lord who needs tribute from vassals to feel powerful. Both derive their strength from sources they cannot control, making them inherently weak regardless of how powerful they might appear. The Machiavellian approach to self-development recognizes that true security comes not from having many people on your side, but from being able to succeed regardless of who is on your side. This does not mean rejecting all alliances or relationships, but rather building them from a position of strength rather than need, choosing them for strategic value rather than emotional comfort, and maintaining the ability to function effectively with or without them. As we advance through this exploration of Machiavellian wisdom, we must understand that the destruction of our weak self is not the goal, it is the foundation. Only by eliminating our vulnerabilities to external manipulation and dependency can we begin to build the kind of strategic intelligence and independent power that allows us to thrive in any environment, whether we are surrounded by allies or standing completely alone. Part 2, Strategic Intelligence and the Power of Isolation. The monastery bells of Sant'Andrea in Percasina rang through the morning mist as Machiavelli began his daily ritual of correspondence, not with the powerful figures he once advised, but with the classical authors whose wisdom had outlasted empires. In his exile, he discovered that isolation was not the absence of power but the distillation of it. Stripped of external influences, freed from the need to maintain appearances or appease patrons, he could see with unprecedented clarity the mechanisms by which power truly operated. This revelation forms the heart of Part 2, that strategic intelligence flourishes in isolation not despite the absence of others, but because of it. When we are alone, we cannot rely on groupthink, cannot hide behind consensus, cannot defer difficult decisions to committees or advisors. We must develop the capacity to see clearly, think independently, and act decisively based purely on our own analysis of reality. Strategic intelligence differs fundamentally from mere intelligence or knowledge.
It is not the accumulation of information but the ability to synthesize information into actionable understanding, to see patterns others miss, to anticipate consequences others cannot foresee, and to identify opportunities others overlook. Most importantly, it is the capacity to make decisions based on objective analysis rather than emotional impulse or social pressure. The development of strategic intelligence requires what we might call cognitive sovereignty, the ability to think independently of prevailing narratives, social pressures, or emotional impulses. This sovereignty can only be achieved through periods of genuine intellectual solitude, where we are forced to confront ideas without the safety net of others' approval or the distraction of others' opinions. Consider the case of Charles Darwin, who spent decades developing his theory of evolution in relative intellectual isolation. Though he corresponded with other scientists, the fundamental breakthrough came through years of solitary observation, analysis, and synthesis. He understood that premature exposure of his ideas to social pressure would corrupt his thinking, forcing him to defend positions before they were fully developed or to modify conclusions based on others' comfort rather than empirical evidence. Only after achieving complete intellectual clarity did he emerge with a theory robust enough to withstand the intense opposition it inevitably faced. The power of isolation lies in its ability to strip away the cognitive noise that clouds judgment in social situations. When we are with others, our brains constantly process social signals, monitor for approval or disapproval, calculate political implications of our thoughts and statements. This social processing consumes enormous cognitive resources and, inevitably, biases our thinking toward what is socially acceptable rather than what is strategically sound. In isolation, freed from these social calculations, we can engage in what Machiavelli termed pure reasoning, analysis unconstrained by the need to maintain relationships or avoid offense. This is where breakthrough insights emerge, where seemingly impossible problems find elegant solutions, where strategic opportunities become visible that were previously obscured by social considerations. The strategic mind learns to view isolation not as deprivation but as laboratory, a space where ideas can be tested, refined, and perfected without external interference. Thomas Jefferson's most profound political insights came during his years of relative retirement at Monticello, where he could think beyond the partisan pressures of his presidential years. Similarly, Napoleon's greatest strategic innovations emerged during his periods of solitary study of military history and geography, not during the social whirl of his imperial court. This cognitive independence manifests in several practical capabilities. First, the ability to gather and analyze information without bias toward confirming popular opinions or our own preconceptions. Second, the capacity to think several moves ahead, considering not just immediate consequences but second and third-order effects of potential actions. Third, the skill of synthesizing seemingly unrelated information into coherent strategic understanding. Fourth, the discipline to separate what we wish were true from what actually is true. The isolated strategic mind develops what we might call reality discipline, an almost ruthless commitment to seeing things as they are rather than as we or others would prefer them to be. This requires emotional regulation of the highest order, because reality is often uncomfortable, inconvenient, or contrary to our desires. Yet only by accepting reality completely can we develop strategies capable of changing it effectively. Strategic intelligence also requires the development of independent judgment, the ability to evaluate ideas, people, and situations based on their merits rather than their sources, their popularity, or their alignment with our existing beliefs. When Admiral Nelson defied conventional naval wisdom at the Battle of Trafalgar, breaking the traditional line of battle to achieve decisive victory, he was demonstrating strategic intelligence developed through years of independent study and analysis, not through committee deliberation or consensus building. The practice of strategic thinking in isolation involves several specific disciplines. Pattern recognition, the ability to identify recurring themes, structures, and dynamics across different domains and time periods. Systems thinking, understanding how various elements interact to produce outcomes that cannot be predicted by analyzing components in isolation. Scenario planning, the capacity to envision multiple possible futures and develop contingencies for each. Resource optimization, maximizing the effectiveness of limited assets through careful allocation and timing. Perhaps most importantly, strategic intelligence requires the development of what we might call temporal thinking, the ability to operate simultaneously in multiple time frames. While others focus on immediate concerns or distant fantasies, the strategic mind can coordinate short-term actions with medium-term positioning and long-term objectives. This temporal flexibility allows for patient accumulation of advantages, strategic withdrawal when necessary, and precise timing of decisive actions. The isolation necessary for developing strategic intelligence is not merely physical but psychological. We must learn to insulate our thinking from the emotional contagion of crowds, the cognitive biases of group dynamics, and the social pressures that push us toward conformity rather than truth. This requires what Machiavelli called the discipline of detachment, maintaining emotional equilibrium even when our analysis leads to unpopular or uncomfortable conclusions. Strategic intelligence recognizes that most people most of the time operate from emotion, impulse, and social conditioning rather than rational analysis. This creates enormous opportunities for those who can think clearly and independently. When everyone else panics, the strategic mind sees opportunity. When everyone else rushes toward the obvious solution, the strategic mind considers alternatives. When everyone else follows the crowd, the strategic mind asks whether the crowd knows where it's going. This intellectual independence becomes particularly powerful when combined with what we might call optionality thinking, the systematic development of multiple potential responses to any situation. Rather than committing to a single course of action, strategic intelligence creates multiple viable pathways forward, preserving flexibility while maintaining forward momentum. The strategic mind also learns to think in terms of leverage points, identifying the small actions that can produce large results, the key relationships that can unlock larger networks, the critical timing that can determine success or failure. This requires seeing beyond surface appearances to underlying structures and dynamics. Frederick the Great's genius lay not in having superior resources, he was consistently outnumbered and outgunned, but in his ability to identify and exploit leverage points that his enemies missed. By moving faster than anticipated, concentrating force at unexpected points, and forcing enemies to fight on multiple fronts, he repeatedly achieved strategic victories despite tactical disadvantages. The development of strategic intelligence in isolation also requires what we might call hypothesis discipline, the systematic testing of our assumptions against reality and the willingness to modify our thinking when evidence contradicts our theories. This is perhaps the most difficult aspect of independent thinking, as it requires intellectual humility and emotional resilience in the face of being wrong. As we prepare to explore Part 3, it's crucial to understand that strategic intelligence is not an abstract intellectual exercise but a practical tool for navigating reality more effectively than those who remain dependent on social validation and conventional wisdom. The person who has developed genuine strategic intelligence possesses a form of power that cannot be taken away, because it exists independently of external circumstances. The transformation from emotional dependency to strategic intelligence represents perhaps the most important investment we can make in our own capability and security. It is the difference between being a leaf blown by social winds and being a force that shapes the environment in which we operate. It is the foundation upon which all other forms of power must be built if they are to prove durable and effective. Part 3. Building unshakable inner power. The final dispatches from Machiavelli's pen came not from a position of restored political power, but from the profound understanding that true strength emanates from within and remains constant regardless of external circumstances. In his later years, having mastered both the strategic intelligence of isolation and the destruction of his weaker self, he achieved something more valuable than any political appointment, the unshakable inner power that made him truly indestructible. This inner power represents the culmination of Machiavellian wisdom, not the superficial interpretation that reduces his insights to mere cunning or manipulation, but the deeper truth that lasting influence flows from an internal foundation that cannot be compromised, corrupted, or destroyed by external forces. The man who achieves this state has transcended the realm of political fortune and achieved what we might call psychological sovereignty. Building unshakable inner power requires understanding that power itself has been fundamentally misunderstood by most people throughout history. They mistake power over others for power over circumstances, external control for internal mastery, the ability to command for the ability to create. True power, the kind that survives exile, betrayal, financial ruin, and social ostracism, exists independently of these external manifestations. The first pillar of unshakable inner power is philosophical sovereignty, the development of a personal worldview so thoroughly examined, tested, and refined that it can withstand any intellectual assault while remaining flexible enough to evolve with new information. This is not dogmatism disguised as conviction, but rather a coherent understanding of reality that has been forged through rigorous independent thinking and validated through experience. Epictetus, who achieved this sovereignty despite being born a slave, demonstrated that external circumstances cannot touch the inner realm of choice and perspective. His philosophical framework provided such robust internal structure that physical bondage became irrelevant to his actual freedom. Similarly, Marcus Aurelius, wielding the ultimate external power as Roman emperor, recognized that this external authority was meaningless without the internal discipline to use it wisely and the inner strength to remain unchanged by its possession. The construction of philosophical sovereignty begins with the systematic examination of our fundamental assumptions about reality, human nature, success, failure, justice, and meaning. Most people inherit these assumptions from their culture, family, or peer group without ever subjecting them to rigorous analysis. The result is a worldview filled with contradictions, vulnerabilities, and dependencies that crumble under pressure. The process involves what we might call belief archaeology, excavating the foundation of our thinking to examine each assumption for validity, consistency, and utility. Why do we believe what we believe about success? What evidence supports our assumptions about human nature? How do our ideas about justice serve us in practice? Which of our beliefs make us stronger, and which make us vulnerable to manipulation or despair? This examination often reveals that many of our deepest beliefs were adopted not because they are true or useful, but because they made us feel comfortable, gained us social approval, or allowed us to avoid difficult realities. The construction of philosophical sovereignty requires the courage to abandon comfortable illusions in favor of uncomfortable truths. The second pillar of unshakable inner power is emotional mastery, not the suppression of emotions, but their intelligent direction toward productive ends. Emotions become powerful tools rather than uncontrollable forces when we understand their function, recognize their triggers, and develop the capacity to channel their energy strategically. This mastery begins with the recognition that emotions are information, not commands. Anger tells us something has violated our boundaries or expectations. Fear warns us of potential threats. Sadness indicates the loss of something we valued. But none of these emotions require us to act immediately or impulsively. The person with emotional mastery can acknowledge the information while choosing their response based on strategic rather than emotional considerations. The development of emotional mastery requires what we might call emotional aikido, the ability to redirect emotional energy rather than resisting it or being overwhelmed by it. When Winston Churchill faced the devastating news of military defeats in World War II, he did not suppress his emotional response or pretend to be unaffected. Instead, he channeled his anger and determination into more effective leadership, his fear into more careful planning, his sadness into deeper empathy for those who suffered. This mastery extends to the emotions of others as well. The person with unshakable inner power cannot be manipulated through emotional appeals, intimidated through displays of anger, or destabilized through others' attempts to provoke guilt, fear, or insecurity. They remain centered in their own emotional sovereignty while maintaining the capacity for appropriate emotional engagement when it serves their purposes. The third pillar is practical competence, the development of skills and capabilities that provide genuine value regardless of social or economic circumstances. This goes beyond mere technical expertise to encompass what we might call fundamental competencies, abilities that remain valuable across different contexts and cannot be made obsolete by technological or social changes. These fundamental competencies include the ability to learn rapidly and independently, the capacity to solve novel problems through creative application of principles, the skill to communicate effectively across different audiences and contexts, the capability to organize resources and coordinate activities effectively, and the resilience to maintain productivity under adverse conditions. The person with unshakable inner power is never truly unemployable because they possess competencies that create value in any environment. They are never truly helpless because they can adapt existing skills to new challenges. They are never truly dependent because their capabilities provide multiple pathways to sustainability and success. Benjamin Franklin exemplified this approach throughout his life, systematically developing competencies in printing, writing, science, diplomacy, business, and politics. Each skill reinforced the others, and, together they provided him with options and influence that no single expertise could have achieved. More importantly, his competencies were portable, they served him equally well in Philadelphia, London, or Paris, in prosperity or adversity, in favor or disgrace. The fourth pillar is creative autonomy, the ability to generate new possibilities rather than merely selecting from existing options. This represents perhaps the highest form of inner power, the capacity to create value, solutions, and opportunities where none existed before. Creative autonomy transforms us from consumers of circumstances to creators of circumstances. This autonomy develops through systematic cultivation of creative capacity. It requires the confidence to think beyond conventional solutions, the skill to synthesize disparate elements into novel combinations, and the persistence to develop rough ideas into practical innovations. Most importantly, it requires the independence to pursue creative insights even when others cannot see their value. Tesla's alternating current system was not an improvement on existing direct current technology, it was a fundamentally different approach that created new possibilities for electrical power distribution. His creative autonomy allowed him to envision and develop solutions that his contemporaries could not even understand, much less appreciate. Though he faced financial hardship and professional ostracism, his inner power remained unshakable because it was based on his capacity to create rather than his ability to convince others. The fifth pillar is temporal sovereignty, mastery over our relationship with time that allows us to operate effectively across multiple time horizons simultaneously. This involves the ability to delay gratification without sacrificing urgent opportunities, to maintain long-term vision without losing short-term effectiveness, and to coordinate actions across different timescales without becoming paralyzed by complexity. Temporal sovereignty recognizes that different aspects of life operate on different timescales. Physical health requires daily discipline. Skill development requires months or years of consistent effort. Wealth accumulation requires decades of patient investment. Reputation building requires sustained integrity across decades. Wisdom accumulation requires a lifetime of learning and reflection. The person with temporal sovereignty can invest appropriately in each time frame without sacrificing the others. They can endure short-term discomfort for medium-term advantage, make medium-term sacrifices for long-term benefit, and balance immediate needs with future possibilities. This creates a form of strategic patience that allows them to outlast and outmaneuver those who operate in shorter time horizons. Warren Buffett's investment philosophy exemplifies temporal sovereignty in action. While others focus on quarterly results or annual performance, he thinks in decades. This temporal perspective allows him to make decisions that appear foolish to short-term thinkers but prove brilliant over extended periods. His inner power derives not from superior intelligence or privileged information, but from the discipline to operate in longer time frames than his competitors. The integration of these 5 pillars creates what we might call anti-fragile resilience, the capacity not merely to survive adversity but to grow stronger because of it. This is the ultimate achievement of Machiavellian wisdom, the development of internal systems so robust and adaptive that external challenges become sources of growth rather than threats to stability. This resilience manifests in practical ways. Financial setbacks become opportunities to develop new income sources. Social rejection becomes freedom from conformity pressure. Professional failure becomes education in what doesn't work. Personal betrayal becomes wisdom about human nature. Each challenge, rather than weakening the person with unshakable inner power, provides new information, new capabilities, and new strength. The person who achieves this integration has transcended the ordinary relationship between individual and environment. They are no longer at the mercy of circumstances because they have developed the capacity to thrive in any circumstances. They are no longer dependent on others' approval because they have developed internal standards more rigorous than any external judgment. They are no longer afraid of loss because they have learned to create value wherever they are. This is not a state of cold detachment or antisocial isolation, but rather a foundation of strength that makes genuine connection and contribution possible. When we need nothing from others, we can give freely. When we fear nothing from circumstances, we can act boldly. When we depend on nothing external, we can engage fully with the external world without being controlled by it.
The achievement of unshakable inner power represents the ultimate practical application of Machiavellian wisdom.
It is not about becoming invulnerable to harm. Mortality ensures that no one achieves true invulnerability. Rather, it is about becoming indestructible in the only way that truly matters, developing internal resources so profound that external circumstances cannot determine our experience, our capability, or our contribution to the world. Machiavelli himself achieved this state not through the restoration of his political career, but through the recognition that his true power lay in his capacity to understand and articulate truths about human nature and political reality that would outlast any particular government or historical period. His exile, which appeared to be the destruction of his power, was actually its purification and concentration. The man who destroys his weak self truly cannot be destroyed by others, not because he becomes physically invulnerable, but because he has developed internal sources of strength that remain constant regardless of external circumstances.
He has achieved what every philosopher and strategist throughout history has sought: genuine freedom through genuine self-mastery. This is the ultimate promise and challenge of Machiavellian wisdom, not the illusion of control over others or circumstances, but the reality of sovereignty over oneself.
In a world that constantly seeks to make us dependent, fearful, and reactive, the development of unshakable inner power represents both the ultimate rebellion and the ultimate achievement. It is the difference between being shaped by our environment and shaping our environment, between being victims of circumstances and being creators of our destiny. The journey from weak dependence to strategic intelligence to unshakable inner power is not easy, comfortable, or quick. It requires sustained effort, uncomfortable honesty, and the courage to stand alone when necessary. But, for those who complete this transformation, the reward is not merely survival or success, but the achievement of genuine human dignity and freedom that no external force can compromise or destroy. Thus concludes our exploration of Machiavellian wisdom, not as a guide to manipulation or cynicism, but as a roadmap to authentic power through authentic self-mastery. The art of thriving when no one has your back is ultimately the art of having your own back so completely that external support, while welcome, is never necessary for your fundamental well-being and effectiveness. In a world that profits from our dependence and fears our independence, the cultivation of unshakable inner power represents both the ultimate personal achievement and the ultimate contribution to human flourishing. For only those who have mastered themselves can truly serve others, and only those who need nothing can give everything.